39 years ago, the Thompson family vanished from their quiet Detroit home on Maple Street, leaving behind a mystery that would consume an entire community. On November 14th, 1985, Robert Thompson, his wife Sarah, and their two children, 12-year-old Michael and 8-year-old Emma, simply disappeared as if they had evaporated into the cold Michigan night. Their sudden absence plunged their extended family into unimaginable grief and confusion, while neighbors whispered theories behind closed doors, each more disturbing than the last. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here, we reopen cold cases with respect and evidence. The discovery came when Robert failed to show up for his shift at the Ford Motor Company plant, where he had worked faithfully for 15 years. His supervisor, concerned by the unusual absence, called the Thompson home repeatedly throughout the day, but no one answered. When evening fell and Robert still hadn't appeared, his brother James drove to Maple Street to check on the family. What he found defied all explanation. The front door was unlocked, groceries sat half unpacked on the kitchen counter, and Sarah's purse lay open on the dining room table with cash still inside. The children's homework was spread across the living room floor, pencils still sharp, as if they had been interrupted mid-sentence. Most disturbing of all, the family's car remained parked in the driveway, keys hanging on the hook by the door. Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison, who led the initial investigation, later described the scene as frozen in time. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no evidence of forced entry. The house looked as though the family had simply stepped outside for a moment and never returned, yet their absence felt absolute, as if some invisible force had erased them from existence. The Detroit Police Department launched an extensive search operation. Officers combed through the neighborhood, questioning every resident within a 6-block radius. They dragged nearby Chandler Park Lake, searched abandoned buildings, and followed up on dozens of tips from concerned citizens. The FBI joined the investigation after a week, treating the case as a potential kidnapping. Despite their efforts, the Thompson family seemed to have vanished without leaving a single trace. Sarah's sister, Margaret Flynn, became the family's voice in the media, pleading for information and refusing to let the case fade from public attention. "They didn't just disappear," she told reporters, her voice breaking. "Someone knows what happened to my sister and her beautiful children. Someone is keeping this terrible secret, and it's destroying our family." Her words echoed through Detroit's newsrooms, but as weeks turned into months, the media attention gradually died down. The investigation revealed few leads. Robert had no known enemies at work. The family had no significant debts, and neighbors described them as quiet, friendly people who kept to themselves. Sarah volunteered at the children's school and attended St. Mary's Catholic Church every Sunday. The children were well liked by their teachers and classmates. There was nothing in their lives that suggested they were in danger. As winter deepened, the case began to grow cold. Detective Morrison continued to work the investigation, but with no new evidence emerging, the department was forced to allocate resources to more recent cases. The Thompson house stood empty, a silent monument to an unsolved mystery. Margaret Flynn refused to give up hope, hiring a private investigator with her life savings, but even he found no new leads. The years that followed were marked by false hopes and cruel disappointments. Every few months, someone would call the police claiming to have seen the family in another state, or a body would be found that matched one of their descriptions. Each time, Margaret would rush to identify the remains or follow up on the sighting, only to have her heart broken again when the lead proved false. By 1990, the official investigation had essentially stalled, though the case remained technically open. The Thompson house was eventually sold to settle the family's affairs, and new residents moved in, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded within those walls. The neighborhood slowly began to heal, but the mystery never truly left. It lingered in hushed conversations and knowing glances, a secret that bound the community together in uncomfortable silence. As we begin this journey into one of Detroit's most haunting, unsolved mysteries, we'll uncover how 25 years of silence finally gave way to a revelation that would shake the very foundations of Maple Street. The truth, as we'll discover, was hidden in plain sight all along. The Thompson family's final day began like any other ordinary Thursday in November 1985. Robert Thompson, 38, kissed his wife goodbye and headed to his shift at the Ford Rouge plant at 6:30 a.m., just as he had done for 15 years. Sarah Thompson, 36, prepared breakfast for Michael and Emma, helped them gather their school supplies, and watched from the front porch as they walked to Jefferson Elementary School, their backpacks bouncing with each step. What makes this day so haunting is its absolute normalcy, a fact that would torment investigators for decades. Sarah had planned to make her famous pot roast for dinner, evidenced by the package of beef still thawing on the kitchen counter when police arrived. She had scheduled a parent-teacher conference for the following week and had written Michael's Conference, Tuesday, 3 p.m. on the calendar that still hung on the refrigerator door. The children's teachers at Jefferson Elementary later told police that both Michael and Emma had seemed perfectly normal that day. Michael had turned in his math homework and participated in a science experiment about magnets. Emma had shared her favorite book during reading circle and helped clean the classroom erasers after school. Their teacher, Mrs. Patricia Henderson, remembered waving goodbye to them at 3:15 p.m. as they walked toward home. Emma skipping ahead while Michael trudged behind, typical behavior for the siblings. According to the timeline investigators pieced together, Sarah had stopped at Miller's Market around 4 p.m. to buy ingredients for dinner. Store clerk Betty Walsh remembered her purchasing ground beef, potatoes and carrots, everything needed for the pot roast she never got to make. The receipt, found crumpled in Sarah's purse, showed the transaction at 4:17 p.m. Security footage from the store, grainy but clear enough, showed Sarah looking relaxed and normal, chatting briefly with Betty about the upcoming Thanksgiving plans. The mystery deepens when we examine what happened next. Robert's shift at Ford ended at 4:30 p.m., and his time card showed he punched out precisely on schedule. His co-workers later told investigators that Robert had seemed in good spirits, mentioning that Sarah was making his favorite dinner, and that he was looking forward to helping Michael with a school project about the Revolutionary War. But somewhere between 4:30 p.m. and 6 p.m., when James Thompson arrived to find the empty house, the family simply ceased to exist in any traceable way. The groceries Sarah had purchased were found half unpacked, suggesting she had made it home and begun preparing dinner. A pot of water sat on the stove, not yet heated, and the oven was cold. The children's backpacks were in their usual spot by the back door, homework assignments still inside. Detective Morrison's investigation revealed several puzzling details that made the disappearance even more mysterious. The family's dog, a golden retriever named Buddy, was found locked in the basement, whimpering and distressed, but unharmed. This was unusual because Buddy typically had free run of the house and yard. More strange was the discovery that all the family's coats were still hanging in the front closet, despite November temperatures that hovered near freezing. The children's bedrooms told their own story of interrupted life. Michael's model airplane kit lay half-assembled on his desk, glue still wet. Emma's coloring book was open to a half-finished picture of a butterfly, crayons scattered across her bed. These details painted a picture of a family that expected to return, that had no reason to believe this day would be any different from thousands of others. Perhaps most unsettling was what investigators found in the living room. The television was still on, tuned to the evening news. A cup of coffee sat on the side table next to Robert's favorite chair, still warm when police arrived. Sarah's knitting project, a winter scarf she was making for Emma, lay on the couch, with the needles still holding stitches, as if she had just set it down for a moment. The FBI's behavioral analysis suggested that whatever happened to the Thompson family occurred quickly and without warning. There were no signs of panic, no overturned furniture, no indication that anyone had tried to run or hide. This led investigators to theorize that the family either knew their abductor or were taken by surprise by someone they trusted. Margaret Flynn, Sarah's sister, provided crucial insight into the family's state of mind in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. "Sarah called me just 3 days before it happened," Margaret recalled during a 1986 interview. She was excited about Thanksgiving plans and Emma's upcoming birthday party. She was worried about Michael's grades in math, normal mother stuff. There was nothing in her voice that suggested fear or concern about anything unusual. The financial investigation revealed no red flags. Robert's bank account showed regular deposits from Ford and modest withdrawals for household expenses. The family had $840 in checking and $2,300 in savings. Not enough money to disappear voluntarily, but also not suggestive of financial desperation that might lead to criminal involvement. Their mortgage payments were current, and they had no significant debts beyond a car loan that was nearly paid off. As investigators dug deeper into the family's final day, they uncovered one puzzling detail that would haunt the case for years. At 5:45 p.m., just 15 minutes before the timeline suggested the family disappeared, a neighbor reported seeing lights on in the Thompson house and hearing what sounded like normal evening activities: the television playing, footsteps upstairs, perhaps the sound of dinner being prepared. This meant that whatever happened to the Thompson family occurred in a window of just 15 minutes, between 5:45 p.m. when they were last observed at home and 6 p.m. when James Thompson arrived to find the house empty and eerily silent. The search for the Thompson family began at dawn on November 15, 1985, just 12 hours after James Thompson's horrifying discovery. Detroit police mobilized the largest search operation in the city's recent history, deploying over 200 officers, K-9 units, and volunteers in a grid pattern that extended 20 miles in every direction from Maple Street. Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison established the command center in Jefferson Elementary School's gymnasium, the same building where Michael and Emma had attended their final day of classes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The school that had been filled with children's laughter just hours before now buzzed with the grim efficiency of a massive search operation. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins representing searched areas, potential leads, and witness statements. The immediate neighborhood became the focal point of intense scrutiny. Officers went door to door, not just asking questions, but requesting permission to search basements, attics, and outbuildings. The response from Maple Street residents was peculiar and would later prove significant. While most neighbors cooperated fully, several longtime residents seemed unusually nervous, offering hesitant answers and avoiding direct eye contact with investigators. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, who lived directly across from the Thompson house, provided the most detailed account of that final evening. She told police she had been washing dishes around 5:30 p.m. when she noticed Robert's car pulling into the driveway. "He looked normal," she recalled, "maybe a little tired from work, but nothing unusual. He waved at me through the window like he always did." Mrs. Chen's testimony placed Robert at home during the critical time window, but she couldn't explain how he and his entire family could vanish so completely within 30 minutes. The search expanded to include Chandler Park, the wooded area where the Thompson children often played. Divers from the Michigan State Police spent 3 days searching the murky waters of the park's small lake, while teams with metal detectors combed through fallen leaves and undergrowth. They found old fishing lures, discarded cans, and the remnants of teenage parties, but nothing connected to the missing family. FBI agent Patricia Mills arrived from the Detroit field office on November 16th, bringing federal resources and expertise in missing persons cases. Her first action was to expand the investigation beyond the possibility of a local crime. "We have to consider that this family may have been taken far from Detroit, she told reporters during a press conference held on the school steps. We're coordinating with law enforcement agencies across the Midwest and beyond. The media attention was unprecedented for Detroit in 1985. Local news stations provided hourly updates, and the story quickly gained national coverage when CNN picked up the case. The image of four smiling faces, Robert in his work clothes, Sarah holding baby Emma, Michael missing his front teeth, became ubiquitous on television screens and newspaper front pages across America. Margaret Flynn emerged as the family's tireless advocate, organizing search parties and keeping the story in the public eye. She established a tip hotline that rang constantly with calls from across the country. Most were well-meaning but useless, claimed sightings of the family in grocery stores from California to Florida, each requiring investigation and inevitably leading nowhere. "Every call breaks my heart a little more," Margaret told Detroit Free Press reporter Linda Martinez, "but I answer everyone because maybe, just maybe, this will be the call that brings them home." The psychological toll on the search teams became evident after the first week. Officers who had started with optimism and determination began showing signs of frustration and exhaustion. Detective Morrison later admitted that the complete absence of clues was more disturbing than finding evidence of violence would have been. "At least with a crime scene, you have something to work with," he reflected years later. With the Thompsons, it was like they had been erased from existence. 3 weeks into the search, investigators received their first substantial lead. A truck driver named Carlos Rivera reported that on November 14th, around 6:30 p.m., he had seen a family matching the Thompsons' description at a rest stop near Kalamazoo, about 140 miles from Detroit. Rivera described a man, woman, and 2 children getting into a blue sedan with out-of-state plates. The timing fit perfectly with the disappearance timeline. This sighting triggered a massive response. Michigan State Police set up checkpoints on major highways, and law enforcement agencies across the Midwest were alerted. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created profiles of potential suspects, focusing on scenarios involving family annihilation or stranger abduction. For 48 hours, it seemed like the break investigators had been desperately seeking, but the lead, like so many others that would follow, ultimately proved false. The family Rivera had seen was located 3 days later in Ohio. Tourists from Pennsylvania who bore a superficial resemblance to the Thompsons, but were clearly different people. The disappointment was crushing for Margaret Flynn, who had driven to Kalamazoo immediately upon hearing the news, only to return home empty-handed once again. As November turned to December, the massive search operation began to wind down. The command center at Jefferson Elementary was dismantled, and the army of volunteers gradually returned to their normal lives. But Detective Morrison and Agent Mills continued their investigation with grim determination, following leads that grew increasingly desperate and far-fetched. One particularly haunting aspect of the search was the discovery of the family's planned activities. Sarah's appointment book revealed that Emma was scheduled for a dental checkup the following week, and she had signed up to bring cookies to Michael's class Christmas party. Robert had requested vacation time for the week between Christmas and New Year's, planning to take the family to visit Sarah's parents in Ohio. These glimpses into their expected future made their absence even more profound and mysterious. The search for the Thompson family officially continued for 6 months, though with diminished resources and fading hope. In that time, investigators followed more than 800 leads, conducted over 300 interviews, and searched areas spanning 5 states. They found nothing. No bodies, no evidence of foul play, no trail leading away from that quiet house on Maple Street. By spring of 1986, the case had been relegated to the cold case files, though Detective Morrison never stopped working it entirely. The search that had consumed Detroit gradually became a memory, then a local legend, and finally, for most people, forgotten history. But on Maple Street, the mystery lingered like a shadow that never quite disappeared, waiting for the day when renovations would finally uncover the truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. In the months following the Thompson family's disappearance, Maple Street transformed from a quiet residential neighborhood into something far more sinister, a community bound together by shared secrets and unspoken fears. While police searched desperately for clues, the residents of this tree-lined Detroit street began exhibiting behavior that, in hindsight, should have raised immediate suspicions. The first sign that something was wrong came during the door-to-door interviews conducted in the initial weeks of the investigation. Detective Morrison noticed that several longtime neighbors provided remarkably similar accounts of November 14th, almost as if they had rehearsed their stories. When pressed for details, these residents became vague and evasive, claiming they couldn't remember specifics about a day that should have been burned into their memories. Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski, who lived 3 houses down from the Thompsons, was particularly suspicious. During her first interview with police, she insisted she had been watching television all evening and hadn't noticed anything unusual. But when officers returned a week later with follow-up questions, her story had subtly changed. Now she remembered hearing a car engine around 6 p.m., then quickly backtracked, saying she might have been mistaken about the time. The most disturbing behavior came from the Hendricks family, who lived directly next door to the Thompson house. Tom and Beverly Hendricks had been neighbors to the Thompsons for 8 years, sharing backyard barbecues and helping with yard work. Their children had grown up playing together, yet when police interviewed them, both Tom and Beverly seemed almost robotically calm, providing minimal information and showing little emotion about their missing neighbors. It was like they were reading from a script, Detective Morrison later recalled. Most people, when their neighbors disappear mysteriously, they're upset, worried, eager to help. The Hendricks were polite and cooperative, but there was something cold about it, something rehearsed. At the time, I thought maybe they were just in shock. Now I wonder what they were really hiding. The children in the neighborhood displayed the most telling signs that something traumatic had occurred. Several parents reported that their kids had begun having nightmares and refused to play outside after dark. 8-year-old Tommy Chen, who lived across the street, started wetting the bed and asking his mother repeatedly if the bad men were coming for his family too. When child psychologist Dr. Rebecca Walsh interviewed neighborhood children at the request of police, she found evidence of widespread trauma that seemed disproportionate to simply having neighbors disappear. Margaret Flynn, Sarah's sister, noticed the strange behavior during her frequent visits to Maple Street to post flyers and talk with residents. There was this feeling in the air, she remembered years later, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something. People would see me coming and suddenly find reasons to go inside. Conversations would stop when I walked by. It wasn't just grief or concern. It was fear. Ooh. The neighborhood's odd dynamics became more apparent during the organized searches. While hundreds of volunteers came from across Detroit to help look for the Thompson family, relatively few came from Maple Street itself. The residents who did participate seemed to steer search teams away from certain areas, claiming they had already been thoroughly checked or weren't relevant to the investigation. One particularly strange incident occurred 3 weeks after the disappearance, when Margaret Flynn organized a candlelight vigil for the missing family. She expected dozens of neighbors to attend. These were people who had known Sarah and Robert for years, who had watched Michael and Emma grow up. Instead, only 6 people showed up, and they stood awkwardly at the edge of the group, leaving quickly after the brief ceremony. The local mailman, George Patterson, who had walked the Maple Street route for 12 years, noticed changes in the neighborhood's daily rhythms. Several residents who had always been friendly and chatty suddenly became withdrawn and avoided conversations. Mail was picked up more quickly than usual, as if people didn't want to linger outside. It felt like the whole street was nervous about something, Patterson told investigators. Perhaps most significantly, a culture of silence developed around any discussion of the Thompson case. Neighbors who had initially been willing to talk with police gradually became less cooperative. Phone calls went unreturned, and people claimed to be too busy to answer follow-up questions. When reporters tried to interview residents for anniversary stories about the disappearance, doors were slammed and window shades were drawn. The psychological impact on Maple Street was profound and lasting. Real estate values plummeted, and several families moved away within the first year, unable to cope with the constant reminder of the mystery. The Thompson house itself became a source of particular anxiety. Children crossed the street rather than walk in front of it, and adults quickened their pace when passing by. Dr. Walsh, the child psychologist who had interviewed neighborhood children, made a troubling observation in her report to police. The trauma patterns I'm seeing are consistent with children who have witnessed something terrible, not children who are simply concerned about missing neighbors. There's a specific type of fear and anxiety that comes from seeing violence or being threatened into silence. Several of these children are exhibiting classic symptoms of suppressed traumatic memories. As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, the strange behavior on Maple Street intensified. Neighbors began avoiding Margaret Flynn entirely, no longer offering polite condolences or expressions of hope. Some residents hired security systems for their homes, despite the fact that Detroit's crime statistics showed their neighborhood to be relatively safe. The collective anxiety was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for something terrible to happen or to be discovered. Detective Morrison, who had worked hundreds of cases in his career, had never encountered anything like the atmosphere on Maple Street. In most investigations, witnesses want to help, he explained. They're eager to provide information, to be part of solving the crime. But these people acted like they were afraid of being found out, like they had something to hide. The more time passed, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a missing family case. It was a conspiracy of silence. The conspiracy would hold for 25 years, sustained by fear, shame, and the gradual departure of witnesses who took their secrets with them. Houses changed hands, children grew up and moved away, and the original residents of Maple Street scattered across the Detroit metropolitan area. But the silence persisted, a toxic legacy that poisoned the neighborhood and left the Thompson family's fate shrouded in mystery. It would take the arrival of new homeowners and the simple act of home renovation to finally crack the wall of silence that had protected a terrible secret for more than 2 decades. The whispers behind closed doors were about to become screams of horror as the truth finally emerged from its hiding place. By 2010, Maple Street had transformed dramatically from the neighborhood the Thompson family once called home. Urban decay had crept through Detroit like a slow poison, leaving many houses abandoned and others occupied by residents who knew nothing of the mystery that had once gripped the community. The original witnesses to that terrible November night in 1985 had either died, moved away, or buried their memories so deep that they almost convinced themselves the truth was just a nightmare. Margaret Flynn, now in her 60s and fighting cancer, had never given up her search for answers. She had spent her life savings on private investigators, psychics, and reward money that was never claimed. Her dining room had become a shrine to the missing family, walls covered with newspaper clippings, police reports, and photographs of Robert, Sarah, Michael, and Emma that seemed to watch her with accusatory eyes. "Every day I wake up and think this might be the day I find out what happened to my sister," she told Detroit Free Press reporter James Mitchell in 2008. "I can't die without knowing." Detective Morrison had retired in 1998, but he couldn't let go of the Thompson case. It had become his white whale, the one investigation that had defeated him completely. He kept copies of all the files in his basement, and every few months he would pull them out and read through the witness statements, looking for something he might have missed. The strange behavior of the Maple Street residents still bothered him, but after 25 years, most of those people were impossible to track down. The Thompson house itself had become a symbol of Detroit's decline. After being sold to settle the family's estate in 1987, it had changed hands 5 times. Each owner had eventually moved out, claiming they couldn't stand living in a house where a family had mysteriously vanished. By 2009, it had been empty for 3 years, its windows boarded up and yard overgrown with weeds. Neighborhood children dared each other to touch the front door, and teenagers told ghost stories about seeing the Thompson family's spirits in the upstairs windows. The few original residents who remained on Maple Street had managed to maintain their conspiracy of silence for a quarter century. Tom and Beverly Hendricks, now in their 70s, still lived next door to the Thompson house. When occasionally asked about their missing neighbors, they would shake their heads sadly and change the subject. Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski had died in 2003, taking her secrets to the grave. The Chen family had moved to the suburbs in 1992, and Dorothy Chen rarely spoke of her years on Maple Street, but secrets have a way of corrupting everything they touch, and the burden of keeping such a terrible truth had exacted a heavy toll on those who carried it. Tom Hendricks had developed a drinking problem by the early 1990s, often sitting on his front porch with a beer in hand, staring at the Thompson house with hollow eyes. Beverly had suffered from severe anxiety and depression for years, jumping at unexpected noises and avoiding her neighbors' questions about the past. The silence might have continued indefinitely, if not for the economic collapse that hit Detroit particularly hard in 2008. Property values plummeted even further, and investors began buying up abandoned houses for renovation and resale. In March 2010, a young couple from Chicago named David and Jennifer Martinez purchased the Thompson house for $18,000, planning to restore it and flip it for a profit. David Martinez was a construction contractor with experience in historical renovation, and Jennifer was an interior designer who specialized in bringing old homes back to life. They had successfully completed similar projects in Chicago and saw the Maple Street house as their entry point into Detroit's emerging real estate recovery market. Neither of them knew about the Thompson family's disappearance. The real estate agent had mentioned only that the house had been vacant for several years. The Martinez couple moved into a rental house nearby while planning their renovation, and their presence immediately changed the dynamics on Maple Street. They were young, enthusiastic, and friendly, greeting neighbors with waves and introducing themselves to anyone they met. Most residents were polite but distant, offering vague warnings about the challenges of renovating in Detroit, but carefully avoiding any mention of the house's dark history. Jennifer Martinez later recalled her first conversation with Beverly Hendricks. "I introduced myself and mentioned we were going to be renovating the house next door. This woman's face just went completely white. She started stuttering and backing away from me. I thought maybe she was afraid of construction noise or something, but it was such a strange reaction. She looked terrified." As spring turned to summer, David and Jennifer began the preliminary work of assessing the property. The house was in better condition than many abandoned Detroit homes. The roof was intact, and there was no significant structural damage. But there was something unsettling about the interior. Personal belongings from the 1980s were still scattered throughout the rooms, as if the occupants had just stepped out for a moment. A child's toy car sat on the living room floor, and faded family photographs were still mounted on the refrigerator. The couple's research into the property's history led them to discover the Thompson family's disappearance, but they initially dismissed it as irrelevant to their renovation plans. "We figured it was just one of those urban mysteries," David explained later. "Detroit has a lot of tragic stories. We thought we were just dealing with an old house that had been neglected for too long." But as they spent more time on the property, taking measurements and planning their renovation, both David and Jennifer began to notice the strange behavior of their neighbors. People would slow down when walking past the house, staring intently at the building before quickly looking away. Cars would drive by slowly, passengers craning their necks to see what the new owners were doing. Most unsettling of all, several elderly residents seemed to be watching the house constantly, as if waiting for something to happen. The breakthrough came in August 2010, when David decided to explore the basement more thoroughly. Previous owners had clearly avoided the space. It was filled with debris and seemed to have been used primarily for storage. As he cleared away boxes of junk left by successive occupants, David noticed something odd about the basement's layout. According to the house's original blueprints, the basement should have been larger than what he could see. There appeared to be space unaccounted for behind the main foundation wall. If this case has already gripped you, hit the like button. It helps the Thompson family story reach more people. August 15th, 2010, began as just another day in David and Jennifer Martinez's renovation timeline. David had spent the weekend clearing debris from the basement while Jennifer worked upstairs, stripping wallpaper and assessing the kitchen's potential. Neither of them suspected that this ordinary Sunday would forever change their lives and finally provide answers to Detroit's most haunting cold case. David had been puzzled by the basement's layout for weeks. According to the 1967 blueprints he'd obtained from the city, the basement should have extended another 8 feet beyond what he could see. The eastern wall appeared to be a later addition, built with different materials and techniques than the original foundation. Most concerning was a strange smell that seemed to emanate from behind that newer wall. Not the typical mustiness of an old basement, but something more organic and deeply unsettling. Around 2 p.m., David decided to investigate further. Using a sledgehammer, he carefully broke through a small section of the newer wall, expecting to find additional storage space or perhaps evidence of old plumbing repairs. Instead, his hammer struck something that shouldn't have been there, what felt like wooden boards just inches behind the drywall. Jennifer was upstairs photographing the kitchen's original tile work when she heard David calling her name. His voice carried an urgency that made her drop her camera and rush to the basement stairs. What she saw when she reached the bottom would haunt both of them forever. David standing frozen in front of a hole in the wall, his face completely drained of color, staring at something inside the hidden space. "I think you need to call the police," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I know what happened to the Thompson family." Through the small opening, Jennifer could see what had stopped her husband cold. Wooden boards had been hastily nailed together to create a makeshift barrier, and behind them was a space that had been walled off for 25 years. Even in the dim basement light, she could make out shapes that were unmistakably human remains. Within 30 minutes, Maple Street was filled with police cars, crime scene investigators, and the first media crews to return to the neighborhood since 1985. Detective Captain Maria Rodriguez, who had inherited the cold case files when Morrison retired, took charge of the scene. As crime scene technicians carefully dismantled the false wall, the horrific truth of November 14, 1985, finally began to emerge. Behind the wall, investigators found the skeletal remains of 4 people arranged in what appeared to be a family grouping. Robert Thompson's wallet, still containing his driver's license and Ford Motor Company ID badge, was found in the pocket of his work clothes. Sarah's wedding ring, inscribed with her and Robert's initials, remained on her finger. Most heartbreaking of all were the small sneakers that could only have belonged to Michael and Emma, still tied in perfect bows, as if their mother had prepared them for school one final time. The forensic examination revealed details that painted a horrific picture of the family's final moments. All 4 victims had suffered blunt force trauma to their skulls, suggesting they had been murdered quickly and efficiently. The absence of defensive wounds indicated they had been caught completely off guard, likely by someone they knew and trusted. Most disturbing was evidence that they had been killed elsewhere in the house and then moved to the basement, where their bodies had been carefully arranged before being sealed behind the false wall. As news of the discovery spread, the conspiracy of silence that had protected this secret for 25 years finally began to crumble. Beverly Hendricks, who had watched the police activity from her front window all day, suffered what her daughter later described as a complete nervous breakdown. She was found by paramedics sitting in her kitchen, rocking back and forth and repeatedly saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. We were afraid he would kill us too." Tom Hendricks, who had maintained his silence for a quarter-century, walked into Detroit Police Headquarters at 6 p.m. that evening and asked to speak with whoever was investigating the Thompson case. What he told Detective Rodriguez over the next 4 hours would expose one of the most shocking betrayals of trust in Detroit's criminal history. According to Tom's confession, the Hendricks family had witnessed the Thompson murders on November 14, 1985. Around 6 p.m., Tom had been in his backyard when he heard what sounded like furniture being moved in the Thompson basement. Curious and concerned, he had looked through the basement window and seen something that would traumatize him for the rest of his life. His neighbor and longtime friend, Robert Chen, Dorothy Chen's husband and the father of 8-year-old Tommy, standing over the bodies of the Thompson family with a bloody hammer in his hand. The revelation was devastating. Robert Chen had been one of the most cooperative witnesses in the original investigation, helping organize search parties and providing detailed statements about the night the family disappeared. He had lived directly across the street from the Thompsons for 6 years, attending neighborhood barbecues and helping Robert Thompson with home repairs. The children played together regularly, and Sarah Thompson had babysat Tommy Chen on numerous occasions. But according to Tom Hendricks's testimony, Chen had been living a secret life of financial desperation and gambling addiction. He owed thousands of dollars to illegal bookmakers and faced threats of violence if he couldn't pay his debts. In his desperation, Chen had learned that Robert Thompson kept a substantial amount of cash in the house, money Robert had saved for a down payment on a new car he planned to buy after Christmas. The plan, as Chen later confessed, was supposed to be a simple robbery. He knew the family's routines and had a key to their house given to him by Sarah for emergencies. He waited until he was sure everyone was home, then entered through the back door, planning to take the money and leave. But when Robert came downstairs and found Chen in his house, the situation escalated beyond Chen's control. In a panic, Chen struck Robert with a hammer he had brought for breaking into a lockbox where he believed the money was kept. When Sarah came running to investigate the noise, he killed her too. Michael and Emma, awakened by their parents' screams, came downstairs to find their neighbor, a man they had trusted, standing over their parents' bodies. Chen, realizing his life was over if the children lived to identify him, made the decision that would haunt him forever. Tom Hendricks had watched in horror as Chen spent the next 2 hours moving the bodies to the basement and beginning the construction of their tomb. When Chen noticed Tom watching through the window, he threatened to kill the entire Hendricks family if they ever spoke about what they had witnessed. He had just murdered 4 people, Tom told Detective Rodriguez through tears. "We were terrified. We had 3 young children. We convinced ourselves that staying quiet was the only way to keep our family safe." The conspiracy expanded beyond the Hendricks family. Chen had enlisted several neighbors to help create alibis and maintain the cover-up, using a combination of threats and appeals to their own fears. Mrs. Kowalski had seen Chen entering the Thompson house, but agreed to keep quiet after Chen convinced her that revealing his presence would make her a target for the same criminals he claimed were after him. Robert Chen had died in a car accident in 1993, taking his secrets to the grave and leaving his surviving co-conspirators to live with their guilt and terror for decades. Dorothy Chen had moved away from Detroit immediately after her husband's death, never knowing the full extent of his crimes. Their son Tommy, now a grown man living in California, would learn of his father's actions through news reports, adding another layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. As investigators continued to examine the crime scene and interview witnesses who could no longer hide behind their wall of silence, the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. More than a dozen residents of Maple Street had known or suspected the truth about the Thompson family's fate, yet none had found the courage to speak until the discovery of the bodies made denial impossible. Margaret Flynn, now 67 and frail from her battle with cancer, stood in the basement of her sister's house and finally saw the answers she had sought for 25 years. "All this time, I thought they might still be alive somewhere," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I never stopped hoping that someday Sarah would call and tell me they were okay. Now I know they were here all along, just a few feet under the ground where their neighbors walked every day." The confession of Tom Hendricks opened a floodgate of revelations that would expose the complex web of fear, guilt, and complicity that had kept the Thompson family's murder secret for 25 years. As Detective Rodriguez and her team began interviewing the surviving witnesses, a disturbing picture emerged of how an entire neighborhood had become accessories after the fact to one of Detroit's most brutal family murders. The conspiracy had its roots in Robert Chen's masterful manipulation of his neighbors' fears and prejudices. In the weeks following the murders, Chen had systematically visited each household on Maple Street, spinning a carefully crafted narrative designed to ensure their silence. He told different versions of the same basic lie, that he had witnessed the Thompson family being murdered by dangerous criminals connected to organized crime, and that anyone who spoke to police about what they had seen would be marked for death. Eleanor Kowalski, who had died in 2003 without ever revealing her secret, had left behind a diary that her daughter discovered after the basement revelation. In entries dating back to November 1985, Mrs. Kowalski had written about her terror and confusion in the days following the Thompson disappearance. "Robert Chen came to see me today," she wrote on November 18, 1985. "He told me terrible things about what happened to the Thompson family. He says the men who killed them are watching the neighborhood, and if anyone talks to the police about seeing strangers around, they'll come for our families next. I'm so scared I can't sleep." The genius of Chen's deception was how he exploited the very real crime problems that plagued Detroit in the 1980s. Drug-related violence was common, and residents of residential neighborhoods lived in constant fear of being caught in criminal crossfire. Chen's story about organized crime involvement seemed plausible enough that frightened neighbors accepted it without question, especially when it came from someone they trusted. Beverly Hendricks, now receiving psychiatric care following her breakdown, provided investigators with the most detailed account of how the conspiracy was maintained over the decades. According to her statement, Chen had held regular informal meetings with the core group of witnesses, ostensibly to discuss neighborhood security, but actually to reinforce their shared commitment to silence. These gatherings continued even after the official police investigation was scaled down, serving as a twisted form of group therapy for people traumatized by their knowledge of the truth. "He was very clever about it," Beverly told Detective Rodriguez during one of her lucid moments. "He would remind us that we were all in it together now, that if one person talked, we would all be in trouble for not speaking up earlier. He made us feel like we were criminals too, like we would go to prison for keeping the secret. After a few years, it became easier to pretend it never happened than to face what we had become." The psychological impact of maintaining such a massive lie had devastated the lives of everyone involved. Tom Hendricks's alcoholism had progressed to the point where he required hospitalization for liver damage. His marriage had ended in divorce in 1998, and he had become estranged from his children, who never understood why their father had become so distant and troubled. "I spent 25 years wishing I was dead," he told investigators. "Every morning I woke up and remembered what I had seen, what I had failed to do. It destroyed everything good in my life." The conspiracy had also required active participation in misleading the investigation. Several neighbors had provided false testimony to police, claiming they had seen nothing unusual on November 14, 1985. Others had allowed Chen to coach them on what to say and what to omit from their statements. Most damaging was their collective decision to avoid mentioning Chen's presence in the neighborhood that evening, despite the fact that multiple witnesses had seen him near the Thompson house around the time of the murders. Detective Morrison, now 72 and suffering from emphysema, was interviewed by Rodriguez about his memories of the original investigation. "I knew something was wrong with those neighbors," he wheezed during their conversation. 25 years later, I still remember the feeling I had when I was interviewing them. They were too calm, too rehearsed, but I never could have imagined it was this bad. An entire street full of people who knew exactly what had happened and chose to protect a murderer instead of getting justice for that family. The financial cost of the cover-up was also significant. Chen had used the money stolen from the Thompson house, nearly $3,000 in cash that Robert had saved for a car down payment, to pay off some of his gambling debts. But his financial problems had continued to escalate, leading him to borrow money from several neighbors under various pretexts. He never repaid these loans, claiming that the same criminals who had threatened the Thompson family were also after him. In total, Chen had extracted more than $15,000 from his neighbors over the years, money they were too afraid to demand back. Perhaps most tragically, the conspiracy had prevented the Thompson family from receiving proper burial for a quarter-century. Margaret Flynn had been forced to hold memorial services without bodies, never knowing whether her sister and her family were dead or alive. She had spent tens of thousands of dollars on private investigators and reward money, resources that could have been used for her own family's needs. "He stole more than their lives," she said during a press conference after the discovery. "He stole 25 years of mourning and healing from everyone who loved them." The revelation of the conspiracy also exposed serious failures in the original police investigation. Despite multiple inconsistencies in witness statements and the unusual behavior of several neighbors, investigators had failed to recognize the signs of a coordinated cover-up. Detective Rodriguez ordered a complete review of the case files, hoping to identify lessons that could prevent similar failures in future investigations. The psychological aftermath of the truth's emergence was almost as devastating as the original crime. Several elderly residents of Maple Street required psychiatric intervention as the weight of their decades-long secret finally lifted. Children and grandchildren of the original conspirators struggled to reconcile their memories of their parents and grandparents with the knowledge that these same people had protected a child killer for most of their adult lives. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the child psychologist who had interviewed neighborhood children in 1985, reviewed her original notes after the basement discovery. "The trauma symptoms I documented back then make perfect sense now," she observed. "These children had witnessed their parents' terror and confusion, even if they didn't understand what was happening. Some of them probably overheard conversations or picked up on the adults' fear. The entire neighborhood was suffering from collective PTSD, and it lasted for decades. The scope of the conspiracy raised disturbing questions about the nature of community and moral responsibility. How does an entire neighborhood agree to protect a murderer? What combination of fear, shame, and group psychology allows good people to become accomplices to unspeakable evil? These questions would haunt Detroit long after the Thompson case was finally solved. As investigators continued to piece together the full extent of the cover-up, they discovered that the conspiracy had even influenced the eventual sale of the Thompson house. Real estate agents had been quietly warned about the property's troubled history, though they were never told the specific details. This had contributed to the house's declining value and its eventual abandonment, creating a cycle of urban decay that affected the entire neighborhood. The anatomical examination of the conspiracy revealed a truth more disturbing than the original crime, that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, are capable of extraordinary moral failures. The residents of Maple Street had allowed their fear to transform them from witnesses into accomplices, from neighbors into betrayers of the very community bonds that should have demanded justice for the Thompson family. As the investigation into the Thompson family murders intensified in the fall of 2010, Detective Rodriguez and her team faced the complex task of reconstructing a crime that had been deliberately obscured by 25 years of lies, fear, and willful blindness. The physical evidence from the basement provided crucial details about the murders, but understanding the full scope of Robert Chen's crimes required piecing together fragments of memory from traumatized witnesses who had spent decades trying to forget what they had seen. The forensic examination of the remains revealed the brutal efficiency of the attack. Dr. Patricia Coleman, the Wayne County medical examiner, determined that all 4 family members had been killed with the same weapon, a claw hammer that investigators later found buried in Chen's former backyard. The pattern of injuries suggested that Robert Thompson had been struck first, likely surprised while coming downstairs to investigate a noise. Sarah had defensive wounds on her arms, indicating she had tried to protect herself, but had been quickly overwhelmed. Most heartbreaking were the findings related to Michael and Emma. The children had been killed in their pajamas, suggesting they had been awakened by the violence and come downstairs to find their parents under attack. The medical examiner's report noted that both children showed signs of having tried to hide, with dirt and debris under their fingernails, consistent with crawling under furniture. Their final moments had been filled with terror as they watched a family friend murder their parents before turning on them. The timeline reconstruction revealed the methodical nature of Chen's cover-up. After killing the family around 6:15 p.m. on November 14, 1985, Chen had spent nearly 3 hours cleaning the crime scene and moving the bodies to the basement. He had used bleach and other household cleaners to remove blood evidence from the main floor, explaining why investigators had found no traces of violence when they first examined the house. The groceries Sarah had been unpacking were carefully arranged to suggest she had been interrupted by something urgent but not violent. Chen's construction of the false wall had been surprisingly sophisticated for someone with no professional building experience. He had used materials stolen from a nearby construction site and had worked through the night to seal the bodies behind a barrier that would remain undetected for 25 years. The wall was built to match the existing basement construction, complete with painted surfaces that made it appear to be original to the house. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of Chen's insurance policy, a detailed written confession that he had hidden in his own house, apparently intending to use it to implicate his co-conspirators if he was ever caught. The document, found during a search of the property where Chen had lived until his death in 1993, contained not only his admission of guilt, but also a list of every neighbor who had helped maintain the cover-up, along with specific details about what each person had witnessed or been told. "I killed the Thompson family for money," Chen had written in his confession. "I never meant for it to happen this way, but once Robert saw me in his house, I had no choice. The children were witnesses. I couldn't let them live to identify me. I made the neighbors help me keep quiet by telling them we would all be killed if anyone talked. They believed me because they were scared, and because it was easier than admitting they were living next door to a murderer." The confession also revealed additional crimes that had never been investigated. Chen admitted to burglarizing several other homes in the neighborhood over the years, using the trust he had built as a helpful neighbor to gain access to houses when families were away on vacation. He had stolen jewelry, cash, and other valuables, always taking small amounts that wouldn't be immediately noticed. The money had fed his gambling addiction, which had grown progressively worse throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. Detective Rodriguez's team also uncovered evidence of Chen's elaborate deception in the weeks following the murders. Phone records showed that he had made numerous calls to Margaret Flynn, offering condolences and volunteer his time for search efforts. He had participated in organized searches for the family, all while knowing their bodies were decomposing in the basement of their own home. Most sickeningly, he had comforted Margaret when she broke down crying during one of the searches, holding her while she wept for her missing sister. The investigation revealed that Chen's gambling debts had continued to mount even after the Thompson murders. The $3,000 he had stolen from their house had bought him only temporary relief from his creditors. By 1987, he was in debt again and had begun borrowing money from the same neighbors he had terrorized into silence. When several of them expressed reluctance to lend him more money, he had reminded them of their shared secret and implied that their continued safety depended on his financial stability. Chen's death in a car accident in 1993 had been ruled accidental, but the investigation file revealed some suspicious circumstances. He'd been driving alone on a rural road outside Detroit when his car left the roadway and struck a tree. There were no skid marks, suggesting he had made no attempt to avoid the crash. His blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit. Whether it was suicide or simply the final act of a man whose life had been destroyed by his crimes, Chen's death had left his co-conspirators to carry their burden of guilt for another 17 years. The psychological evaluation of the surviving witnesses revealed the devastating impact of their prolonged silence. Dr. Michael Harrison, a forensic psychiatrist who interviewed several of the key figures, found evidence of severe trauma that had affected every aspect of their lives. These people have been living with untreated PTSD for 25 years, he reported. The guilt of their silence, combined with the fear Chen instilled in them, created a perfect storm of psychological damage. Some of them genuinely believed that speaking out would result in their own deaths. The revelation of Chen's crimes also exposed the tragic irony of the neighbors' fear. The criminal organization that Chen had claimed was monitoring the neighborhood had never existed. His threats of violence against anyone who spoke to police had been empty. But the residents of Maple Street had never tested his claims. Their terror had been based on lies, but it had been real enough to silence them for a quarter century. As the truth emerged, investigators began to understand how Chen had managed to maintain such an elaborate deception for so long. He had been a master manipulator who understood exactly which psychological buttons to push to keep his neighbors silent. He had exploited their fear of crime, their guilt over not protecting the Thompson family, and their growing shame over their continued silence. Each year that passed made it harder for them to come forward, as they would have to explain not only what they knew, but why they had remained quiet for so long. The investigation also revealed the broader impact of the conspiracy on the Detroit Police Department's ability to solve the case. The false statements provided by witnesses had led investigators down numerous dead ends, wasting resources and preventing them from focusing on the real perpetrator. If even one neighbor had told the truth in 1985, the case would have been solved within days, and the Thompson family could have received proper burial while their memories were still fresh in the community's mind. Margaret Flynn, who had waited 25 years for answers, finally learned the full truth about her sister's final moments. The knowledge was both a relief and a renewed source of pain. "I always wondered if they suffered," she told reporters after being briefed on the forensic findings. "Now I know they did, and I know it was someone they trusted who caused that suffering. That makes it even worse somehow, but at least I can finally lay them to rest." The conclusion of the Thompson family murder investigation in early 2011 brought both closure and frustration to a case that had haunted Detroit for 26 years. While the physical evidence and witness confessions had finally revealed the truth about that terrible November night in 1985, the passage of time had made traditional justice impossible. Robert Chen had escaped earthly accountability for his crimes when he died in 1993. leaving behind a community scarred by decades of silence and complicity. District Attorney Catherine Morrison, no relation to the original investigating detective, faced the difficult decision of whether to prosecute the surviving conspirators who had helped cover up the murders. After extensive deliberation with her staff and consultation with the victims' families, she announced that no charges would be filed against the neighbors who had maintained their silence for 25 years. While their actions were morally reprehensible and legally questionable, Morrison explained at a press conference, the passage of time, their cooperation with the current investigation, and the extraordinary circumstances of intimidation they faced make prosecution unlikely to serve the interests of justice. Margaret Flynn supported the district attorney's decision, though not without reservation. "These people lived next door to my sister's grave for 25 years, she said during an emotional statement to the media. They let me suffer, wondering and hoping and praying that Sarah and her children might still be alive somewhere. But they were victims too, in their way. Robert Chen stole their peace of mind just like he stole my sister's life. Prosecuting them now won't bring Sarah back, and it won't heal the damage that's already been done." The Thompson family was finally laid to rest in Woodlawn Cemetery on March 15, 2011, exactly 25 years and 4 months after their murders. Hundreds of people attended the funeral service, including many who had joined the original search efforts in 1985. Margaret Flynn, weak from her ongoing battle with cancer, delivered a eulogy that captured both her grief and her relief at finally having answers. "My sister Sarah was a woman of faith," Margaret said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "She believed that the truth always comes to light eventually, even when darkness seems to have won. Today, we know she was right. The truth did come to light, and Sarah, Robert, Michael, and Emma can finally rest in peace, surrounded by the love they were denied for so many years." The investigation's conclusion prompted a comprehensive review of cold case procedures by the Detroit Police Department. The Thompson case had revealed significant flaws in the original investigation, particularly the failure to recognize signs of witness intimidation and conspiracy. New protocols were established for identifying and protecting witnesses who might be afraid to come forward, and additional training was provided to detectives on recognizing patterns of community-wide silence that might indicate organized cover-ups. Detective Captain Rodriguez was promoted to lead the department's cold case unit, with a mandate to apply lessons learned from the Thompson investigation to other unsolved crimes. "This case taught us that sometimes the biggest obstacle to solving a murder isn't the absence of witnesses," she explained. "Sometimes it's the presence of witnesses who are too frightened or too compromised to tell the truth. We have to do a better job of creating safe spaces for people to come forward, even years after a crime has been committed." The psychological aftermath of the case's resolution continued to reverberate through the survivors' lives. Tom Hendricks entered intensive therapy and eventually relocated to Arizona, unable to continue living on the street where he had kept such a terrible secret. Beverly Hendricks remained in psychiatric care, struggling with severe depression and anxiety that her doctors said might never fully heal. Several other elderly residents of Maple Street moved to assisted living facilities, finally escaping the physical reminder of their moral failure. The discovery also had a profound impact on the Chen family survivors. Dorothy Chen, who had remarried and was living in California under her new husband's name, learned of her first husband's crimes through news reports. She issued a statement through her attorney expressing horror at Robert's actions and sympathy for the Thompson family, while requesting privacy for herself and her son. Tommy Chen, now 33 and working as a teacher in San Diego, struggled to reconcile his childhood memories of his father with the reality of his crimes. "I keep thinking about all the times he helped me with homework or taught me to ride a bike," Tommy told a reporter who tracked him down. "How do you process the fact that those same hands that tucked you in at night also murdered children?" I've been in therapy for months, and I still can't understand how I never saw any sign of what he was capable of. The Thompson house itself became a symbol of both tragedy and redemption. David and Jennifer Martinez completed their renovation in 2012, transforming the crime scene into a beautiful family home once again. They chose to stay and live in the house despite its dark history, arguing that filling it with new life and love was the best way to honor the Thompson family's memory. They planted a memorial garden in the backyard and placed a small plaque by the front door reading, "In memory of the Thompson family, may they rest in peace." The case also prompted changes in real estate disclosure laws in Michigan. The Thompson house had changed hands multiple times without buyers being informed of its connection to a missing persons case, let alone a murder scene. New legislation required real estate agents to disclose any known history of violent crimes on properties, giving buyers the opportunity to make informed decisions about purchases that might carry psychological burdens. Margaret Flynn lived long enough to see her sister's family properly buried and to witness the completion of the investigation that had consumed her adult life. She died peacefully in her sleep on December 3, 2011, 8 months after the funeral service. Her obituary noted that she had spent 26 years fighting for justice for her sister's family and had never given up hope that the truth would eventually emerge. She was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery, just a few feet from the sister she had never stopped searching for. The Thompson case became a subject of academic study, with criminologists and psychologists examining how fear and group psychology could sustain such an extensive conspiracy for so many years. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, who had interviewed neighborhood children during the original investigation, published a research paper titled "Collective Trauma and Community Silence: Lessons from the Thompson Family Murders" that became required reading in criminal justice programs across the country. The case also inspired changes in how missing persons investigations are conducted nationwide. The FBI developed new protocols for identifying potential witness intimidation in cases where entire communities seem unusually uncooperative or where witness statements show suspicious patterns of similarity. Training materials now include the Thompson case as an example of how organized silence can derail investigations and delay justice for decades. Perhaps most importantly, the case served as a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied. While Robert Chen escaped prosecution for his crimes, the truth about his actions and the conspiracy that protected him was finally exposed. The Thompson family received the dignified burial they deserved, and their story became a cautionary tale about the importance of courage in the face of evil. As Detective Rodriguez reflected in her final report on the case, "We couldn't put Robert Chen on trial, but we could ensure that his victims were finally treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. We couldn't undo 25 years of silence, but we could make sure that silence was finally broken. Sometimes that's the best justice we can achieve, not perfect but real and long overdue." Now, the Thompson family murder case officially closed on June 1, 2011, marked "solved by investigation" in the Detroit Police Department's records. It remains one of the longest-running conspiracy cover-ups in American criminal history and stands as a testament to both the destructive power of fear and the eventual triumph of truth over silence. In the end, the renovation that David and Jennifer Martinez had planned as a simple house-flipping project became something far more significant. The final chapter in a 26-year story of murder, conspiracy, and ultimate redemption. Their sledgehammer broke through more than just a basement wall. It shattered decades of silence and finally allowed 4 innocent souls to rest in peace. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cold cases and disturbing mysteries from across America. Thank you for following the Thompson family's story. We'll see you in the next video.